Now, today we're going to be looking at the French Revolution, which goes from about 1789 until, I would say, most historians would agree, 1815 with the Congress of Vienna and the downfall of Napoleon. The French Revolution is one of those major turning points in European history that can't be ignored, and we really have to look at. It's really going to turn the established order that had been around for hundreds of years upside down, and it's going to create this change, this need for change throughout Europe and other countries. So it's just a huge impact on Western civilization as we know it. Now, to understand the French Revolution and why it happened in the first place, you need to understand what was happening in Europe in the last 100 years before the actual 1789 revolution. Europe, around 1700, enters what's called the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is also known as the Age of Reason. All right, the Age of Reason is a term applied to it oftentimes because mankind, for the first time in Western society, thought that reason and our thought process alone could solve all of our problems. So, Europe prior to 1700, had gone through a series of religious wars after the Reformation, and people during the Reformation in the Middle Ages had put so much into religion, and look where it had gotten them. It got them, the wars of sectarian violence between Protestant and Catholic, the French Wars of Religion, the 30 Years' War, so it just goes on. It was a very violent time. So people in the early 1700s looked to the past and saw what religion had caused, and felt that society and mankind in general had gone in the wrong direction. All right, so for the first time, these enlightened philosophers are going to say that reason can be applied to everything. If we have a problem, we can apply reason to it to solve it. So you would apply reason to the idea of religion. You would apply reason to medicine. And you would apply reason to politics. Most of Europe in the year 1700 was run by monarchies, with few exceptions. And these monarchs had a complete control over that state. Monarchs at the time had what was called divine right, basically meaning that they legitimized their rule by saying that God made them king. So God made me king, and that's why you follow me. So now for the first time we get the enlightened political philosophers saying, nah, political legitimacy should come from some other source. It shouldn't come from God. It should come from the people themselves, the people being governed. All right, so this is going to turn everything upside down, basically, in the established order in Europe. Now, we have in France, with the French monarchy, is probably the best example we have in European history of absolute monarch. Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, a couple generations before the French Revolution, totally established the French monarch as absolute. He called himself the Sun King, and most famously declared that he was the state. So he carried that idea of what a French king should be onto his successors, basically. So by the time we get to the 1780s, the French monarchy, or the ancient regime as it's called, is firmly established. The French king has a tremendous amount of wealth and power, and if you look over the picture on the right, lived in the extravagant palace at Versailles, about 10 to 12 miles outside of Paris, one of the most extravagant palaces in all of Europe. So the tremendous amount of wealth that the ancient regime or the kings had was pretty incredible when we compare how they lived to the rest of French society, how the peasants lived. So it was not a very even society. Now, the French in the 1780s were in a pretty tough place. The French had lost a majority of their empire in 1763 after the French and Indian War, in a disastrous war with the British. In order to kind of get back at their old enemies, the British, the French lent their support to the Americans in their revolution against the British, and helped them win that war as a result of this French aid. However, it was very expensive for the French to do this. So by the time you get to this early 1780s, you know, France as a country is basically in a tremendous amount of debt on an international scale. And because of this poor economic situation for France, it's really going to trickle down to affect basically the peasants more than anybody else. On top of that, the peasants are going to be having to deal with poor wheat harvests in the 1780s. Weather conditions in the 1780s were cooler than other decades. Some historians attribute this to the Little Ice Age. But as a result of this cooler weather and cooler temperatures in the 1780s, the wheat crop completely fails in a lot of places, making bread very expensive. And bread made up a large portion of the French peasants' diet. So it's a pretty bad situation to be in if you're a French peasant. However, the aristocracy, the ancient regime, kind of pictured here in this cartoon, continued to live a lavish lifestyle, eating meat and stuff like that, not just bread, lots of wine, and just, you know, living a lifestyle that the peasants couldn't ever afford to attain. Now, the economic crisis in France gets so bad that the king and his ministers are forced to call on what we call the Estates General. Now, the Estates General is a legislative body that meets with the king, and they try to solve a problem. All right. Now, the last time the Estates General had been called upon was in 1614. So it had been over 100 years plus that the Estates General had been called on. And the reason for this is because the French kings were absolutists. They didn't want to necessarily share power with any kind of body. But the situation becomes bad enough in the late 1780s that it's decided to call on the Estates General again. Now, the Estates General is made up of 3 different estates. The first estate is the clergy. All right. Now, the clergy are traditionally exempt from taxation from the government. Traditionally, there were a few exceptions in there. The second estate would be the nobility. Now, the nobility, this second estate, has 25% of the land ownership in the country. They hold a tremendous amount of wealth, and they're really the most powerful of the estates. The third estate were the common people. This is about 80% of the population represented here in the third estate. And what we see here is kind of a middle-class kind of mixture. City dwellers, professionals. These people are going to be known as the bourgeoisie later on, kind of this up-and-coming class. But it's going to be the Estates General that really tries to bring this all together. Now, the third estate is what's really going to shake things up here. They're the ones that are going to kind of want to, you know, more authority. Once you're given something, a little taste of something, you typically want more. And that's what we're going to see here happen with the third estate during the Estates General. Now, during this time, the third estate is going to start to publish pamphlets that are kind of inflammatory and questioning the regime a little bit. But a lot of members of the third estate here were very much influenced by the Enlightenment and the ideas of the Enlightenment. They were also influenced by what was going on in the United States, how they had helped the Americans gain their freedom and independence from another power, a monarchy basically, and the Americans established a republic. A lot of French individuals from this third estate really felt that, you know, France had to change as well. This is called the moderate phase of the French Revolution. It's basically the beginning of the third estate really taking control and what they were trying to put in place. You got to understand, a lot of revolutionaries from the third estate at this time really just wanted to have a constitution. They wanted a constitutional monarchy. A lot of them at this time didn't necessarily want to get rid of the king. They wanted to keep the king. They wanted a system that was closer to like what the British had. All right, they just wanted some type of constitution. But we're going to see how that changes here in just a little bit. Now, the third estate at this time is going to be caught up in such a frenzy of change and what they can actually accomplish. It's a very optimistic way to look at their change. They felt they could really do some good for France. But however, by June of 1789, the third estate is going to declare itself the National Assembly. All right, so this is a separate body from the Estates General. Now, the king at this time kind of doesn't have much of a backbone. Kings of the past probably would have put this down pretty roughly and violently, but King Louis does not. Louis the 16th. He doesn't dissolve the assembly. He doesn't arrest anybody. But basically what he does is he decides he's going to lock the meeting place where the National Assembly meets, or where they were planning on meeting. So the members of the National Assembly were thinking that at any time the king is going to arrest him or kill him, and it's going to be over. So the next day they get up and they go to the assembly hall, and the doors are all locked. So a lot of them were probably thinking that they're going to be arrested at any moment. They were locked out of the assembly room. So they looked around the grounds, and all they could find was an indoor tennis court that was open. So they went into the indoor tennis court, and it was there that they took a vow that the next time that they meet, there will be a constitution for France. So this is called the tennis court oath, and it's kind of this optimistic turning point in the French Revolution. After this, though, the king kind of beefs up defenses in Paris, and things become a little bit more tense after this point. Now, the summer of 1789 is a pretty eventful time. The first event that happens in the early summer is the storming of the Bastille. Now, the Bastille was a very large medieval castle in Paris, and it was basically acted as a dungeon for political prisoners, and it also had a small cache of weapons. But to these revolutionaries from the Third Estate, now the Third Estate's movement has grown to people in the streets of Paris. The common people in Paris are starting to get behind this idea of revolution and change, and the fact that they're starving and that they want some kind of change. So they looked at the Bastille, this daunting-looking medieval fortress, as a symbol of the ancient regime, as a symbol of Louis the 16th and his wife. So basically, they storm it, and they overcrowd the place. They take the guards. The mob just completely surrounds the guards and kill the guards. They then decapitate the heads of the guards, and they put them on sticks, and then they start storming through the Bastille. This is kind of the first time that the French Revolution, turns violent, and there's a lot more violence to come. So once they entered the Bastille, they freed whatever political prisoners were in there, and there were only a couple. And then they took whatever weapons were there, and then they started dismantling the Bastille brick by brick, just dismantling this symbol of the ancient regime. But by August of 1789, we're going to have the National Assembly creating what's called the Declaration of Rights of Man and the Citizen. And basically it writes out, kind of like the American Bill of Rights does, guaranteed individual rights. What every person, rich or poor, is given by God, basically. All right, so again, the Declaration of Rights of Man and the Citizen is a very great example of the Enlightenment being put into practice. All right, so this is that time in the French Revolution where people are really optimistic of how they can change and how they're going to change France for the better. Now we fast forward to October of 1789, and not a lot had changed for the people in Paris. The fervor of the optimism and fervor of the initial revolution was kind of wearing off. Winter was on the approach, and you're going to have a large number of workers or poor workers in Paris who are hungry, starving. They can't afford bread. So to these poorer people within the cities, not much had really changed with this revolution. The king was still in power. Louis the 16th was still in power, and he obviously resided in Versailles, again outside the city of Paris. And not enough change had happened, according to a lot of people. So in October of 1789, you're going to get a number of women, up to 7,000 women, who worked in industries that required them to lift a lot and do a lot of physical labor. And these women were pretty muscular and tough. So these women that were workers, had children. They couldn't afford to feed their children. And so by the time you get to October of this year, they're pretty whipped up into a frenzy, and they're really angry. So this mob of women just march the 11 to 12 miles to Versailles, and And by the time they get to Versailles, they're tired, they're angry, they're hungry, and they're just whipped up into a frenzy. So they get to the palace, and again, it's being guarded by a couple of guards. The women overtake the guards and again decapitate them and put them on sticks. And then they go through the palace of Versailles looking for Marie Antoinette, the queen, trying to find her because they're taking all their vengeance out on her. So Marie Antoinette narrowly escapes these women. She sneaks over to her husband's apartment, and the two of them kind of negotiate with the crowd from the balcony. Louis the 16th offers to give the women all the flour in the palace. The women take the bread, take the flour, and that's not enough for them. They want more. And so they force Louis and his wife Marie Antoinette to come to Paris with them. All right. So at this time, the king has no choice. He goes with the mob, and basically Louis and his wife Marie Antoinette are taken to the Louvre in Paris, and that's their acting residence for the time being. So they're in the city now. So they're basically under the watch of the people. They're not at their posh Versailles palace anymore. So it's a major turning point in the revolution, because for the first time now it almost seems like the king is under house arrest. All right, he's free, yes, but he's not really that free. So the revolution kind of takes a revolutionary turn at this point. Now, by 1791, a new constitution is issued for France, and France becomes a constitutional monarchy, with the king, again, under house arrest in Paris. There are three major political factions to come out of this era of the French Revolution. You got the Royalist Democrats, who are for a constitutional monarchy, the National Party, who are kind of in the center, and then for the first time you have the Jacobins, who are a more radical faction in this fight. And they're going to be really important later on. So, with this, the king and his family feel unsafe. There's a radical faction in this revolution that the king feels he can't really trust. And again, he's under house arrest. So Louis has to be thinking to himself that at any minute, this radical faction could take over, and who knows what could happen to me. So by the time you get to August of 1791, Louis decides that he's going to leave Paris. He's going to book it. So Louis, his wife, and their children get into a carriage in the middle of the night, and they head for the Austrian border. Marie Antoinette is from Austria, so it was decided that they could flee to Austria, and they could get help from the Emperor of Austria, and they could regain their throne totally, and they could get rid of these revolutionaries. So the king and his family flee in the middle of the night, and they're kind of in disguise. They're disguised as basically bourgeois middle-class individuals. Nothing but not royalty, though. So they've got all the forged papers as well to go along with it, all the passports and what have you. So the king and his wife get really close to the Austrian border. And basically, the king hands over falsified papers to one of the guards. The guard at the time doesn't buy it. So the king decides he's got one last chance. He's going to show him who he is. So he takes off his cloak, revealing his royal crest underneath on his chest. And the guard is pretty much overcome by a lot of emotions and pretty much stunned to see his king standing right before him, that it almost looks like he's going to let him go. But just then a group of Revolutionary Guards, French soldiers, come out of nowhere, and they don't take too kindly for the fact that the king is trying to flee, and they place the king and his family under arrest, and they take him back to Paris. So this flight to Austria really hurts the king. To a lot of French citizens who before had been kind of moderate and for a constitutional monarchy, now saw King Louis as a traitor, that he was fleeing to Austria, that he was abandoning them. So, because Austria wasn't their enemy at the time, they were fighting the Austrians. So it was seen as this huge betrayal by the French people, and it's really not going to help his situation out very much. Now, I mentioned that the Austrians were the enemy. of the French. And so we got to look at how the rest of Europe really reacted to the French Revolution. So this revolution occurs on a continent that is mostly monarchies, with the exception of a couple constitutional monarchies. And we see this kind of violent revolution take place in Paris. It's really turning things upside down in that country. So the Austrians, the different German states, the British, the Russians later on, are all going to look at the French Revolution as basically a cancer. That this cancer is going to spread to our country, and the same thing is going to happen in our country. So a lot of these crowned heads of Europe really feared revolution. So they were willing to go to war to put it down. And that's what you're going to have. You're going to have a number of wars of the French Revolution that involve, foreign coalitions going off to fight the French. Now, there are many in this on the French side that saw this French Revolution as a global thing that should change, that revolution should spread to other countries. So, the crowned heads of Europe were kind of right to assume that. But again, the crowned heads would have seen this as something that they had to contain. They got to contain it in France, or they have to snuff it out. All right, so that's going to be the goal of all these other European countries until 1815. So between 1789 and 1815, you had this constant struggle and fighting going on in Europe to basically put down the French Revolution. Now, as we get into this phase of the French Revolution, you got two major political sides that emerge that are going to start to dominate. After the king tried to flee to Austria, you got two sides that dominate the French Revolution. The Jacobins, who are going to be the more radical faction headed by Robespierre, and the Girondins, pictured here on the right. The Girondins are more moderate. That runs anywhere from, wanting the king to have more power to a constitutional monarchy. But the Girondins, for the most part, are for basically a constitution for France and a constitutional monarchy. The Jacobins, on the other hand, you have to realize are for a republic. And a republic means there's no king. All right, that France is without a king. So it's going to be a big struggle between the Jacobins and the Girondins here at this time. Now, by 1792, summer of 1792, the Jacobins are going to be kind of starting to dominate the political scene in Paris. A number of radical city dwellers are going to kind of support the Jacobins. People that have nothing are really going to get behind their idea of a republic to try to get rid of the old order of the kings. So by September of 1792, you're going to have the Jacobins declaring the National Convention, which is the new governing body of France. And on September 21st, 1792, the monarchy is officially abolished, and you have the establishment of the First French Republic. Now, the king is seen by the Jacobins as just another citizen. In a lot of their rhetoric, they're going to refer to him oftentimes as Citizen Louis, to show that he's no longer who he used to be. So there's going to be, obviously, a split on what to do with the king. There's going to be a number of Girondins, again, within the National Convention who want to, let him live. But there's a number of Jacobins that see the king as a threat. And they feel that the only way to get rid of him, the only way that the revolution can survive is you got to kill the king. If you let the king go, let him go into exile, he might come back in 10 years. His son might come back in 20. So it was decided by the Jacobins basically to put the king on trial and bring botched up evidence before the convention. This time, when we get the founding of the First French Republic and then the death of the king in January of 1793, we get what's called the radical phase of the French Revolution. This is where it begins to become more bloody, more radical, and it's going to take a different route than what was originally intended. A lot of the people that got on board with this revolution in the first place were more moderate, had more moderate ideas for change. Now we have completely radical ones. Now, King Louis is put on trial, and he's executed by guillotine in January of 1793. So basically, that's pretty much the beginning of this radical phase that I just mentioned a little bit ago. Robespierre, pictured here on the right, is the leader of the Jacobins. He's kind of the symbol of this radical phase of the revolution. Now, Robespierre sits on a committee within the National Convention known as the Committee of Public Safety. And it was the Committee of Public Safety's job to basically investigate and snuff out enemies of the revolution. Now, the French were fighting wars against foreign enemies to save their revolution, but they also felt that there were lots of people in France, in the streets of Paris, who were enemies of this revolution as well, and that they needed to bring these people to justice. So we get what's called the Reign of Terror during this phase of the revolution. Now, targets of the Reign of Terror are going to be royalist supporters, Girondins, those were the moderates again, and anybody who they saw as opposition to the revolution. So if you were accused of being an enemy of the revolution in any way whatsoever, you may find yourself a target of this. And so a number of people are going to fall victim to this Reign of Terror, and thousands of people are going to be killed. Within a 9-month time period, there's about 16,000 people killed in Paris alone. On top of that, you're going to have a number of counter-revolutionary movements springing up in France, most notably in the Vendée region of France, Lyon also, in which these people, lots of them Catholics or Catholic supporters, are going to fight the Jacobins and this revolution. So the Jacobins are known to have gone into some of these towns that were known to be anti-revolutionary and kill thousands of people, line them up on a wall and shoot grape shot at them. So the Reign of Terror really is the bloodiest part of the revolution, and there's many, many victims to Robespierre's terror. Now, as mentioned before, counter-revolution was also a problem. So a number of people are going to be victims of these counter-revolutionary movements as well. Now, the preferred method of execution for all these victims during the Reign of Terror was the guillotine, pictured there on the left, oftentimes nicknamed the National Razor. The guillotine, if you can see from the picture, the hole at the bottom was for your head. You'd be face down, and then they'd pull the string, and the blade would come down pretty quick. It was invented as a means to be humane. It was supposed to be instantaneous death, that you're not going to feel a thing. So this was utilized a lot during the French Revolution to get rid of enemies of the revolution. But we don't know how quickly the death was from the guillotine. There's still accounts of people getting their heads cut off, and then the executioner was supposed to pick up the head that's severed out of the basket and show the crowd. And there was oftentimes accounts of these severed heads, still moving, their eyes kind of still moving, their lips kind of still moving. So some people saw that as, well, they're obviously still alive, when probably, in fact, it was, reflexes from having your head cut off. But this is going to be a symbol of the revolution, for good or for bad. Now, by July of 1794, after all these years of basically terror, Robespierre is going to make a lot of enemies. At this time, the radicals in the revolution changed the year. Instead of it being like 1792, that was the year 1, because 1792 was the start of the French Republic. So they started that off with the year 1, and it just went from 1, 2, 3 after that. So it became a little bit more radical. The calendar in general was completely revamped. All the months of the year, traditional months of the year, were gotten rid of. 10-day calendar was tried to put into place, or be put into place. New names for months were invented, like Brumaire for October, Thermidor for July, and all these have revolutionary meanings. So basically, Robespierre also tried to get rid of organized religion and basically try to radicalize the revolution. Notre Dame Cathedral became the cathedral of reason, instead of Notre Dame. So it was dedicated to reason under Robespierre's reign. Playing cards, for example, instead of having like a king, a queen, a jack, there would be cards like citizen and, you know, worker, soldier, what have you, anything that wasn't royal. So they tried to completely change French society. Now, Robespierre, after having so many victims under the Terror, obviously is going to make a few enemies. Somebody knew somebody who was a victim of Robespierre's terror, if you would. So, Robespierre, kind of getting too big for his britches, basically, goes into the chamber of the National Convention and basically says to a lot of the people in the chamber that I have a list right here. On this list is people in this room, and on the list, I know which ones of you are enemies of the revolution. And so this whole assembly heard this, and like a lot of the people in the assembly were asking to see the list. I want to see it. And Robespierre is like, no, I'm not going to show you, but I'm leaving. So obviously the people in the chamber were a little upset by this and felt that Robespierre now had gone too far. He was now accusing people within the legislative body. So an outlaw or a warrant goes out basically for Robespierre's arrest, that he's now an enemy of the Republic himself. So Robespierre, in a hotel room with a couple of his colleagues, gets word that there's a warrant out for his arrest, and so basically he makes preparations on what he's going to do next. While he's in his hotel room, there's a knock on the door. He knows it's guards coming to take him away, soldiers. So right when the soldiers enter the room, there's a gunshot that goes off. On the floor in one of the rooms is one of his associates, one of Robespierre's associates. And then they hear another gunshot upstairs, and they find Robespierre just laying face down on a desk with a gun in his hand and a gunshot wound to his head. So when they looked at him a little closer, it looked like he had attempted suicide, but had failed because the bullet had gone through his jaw, shattering his jaw, but he was still alive. He just couldn't talk, and he was bleeding and in a lot of pain. So they took Robespierre, that's the picture on the right there, to the committee chamber, and they got to decide what to do with him. So all the while they're yelling at him, mocking him, and Robespierre can just sit there because his jaw is shattered and he's bleeding all over the place and he's in a lot of pain. So basically, it's decided over the night, over the course of 24 hours, that they're gonna execute Robespierre. That he's the problem. He's the guy who led this revolution to a place where we didn't want to go. So Robespierre has a handkerchief holding up his jaw because it's completely shattered, covered in blood. The revolutionaries get him out of the chamber the next day. He's still in a lot of pain and can't talk. And he's pretty much sentenced really quick at his trial, found guilty, sentenced to death, and he's put on the guillotine. Now, when they get him up to the guillotine, the executioner grabs his handkerchief that's holding his jaw up and just pulls it loose. Robespierre's jaw just drops. He screams in pain. And then they put him on the guillotine. But according to some accounts, sometimes legend, I guess you could say, they put him face up on the guillotine rather than face down. That way he could see the blade coming right before it cut his own head off. Now, this ends this radical phase of the French Revolution. This is more famously known as the Thermidorian reaction, named after the month in which it took place. And it's basically a cooling point in the French Revolution. So we've gone from a moderate phase to a radical phase, and now we're going back to kind of a moderate phase again, with the Thermidorian reaction. Now, after the Thermidorian reaction, you're going to have the Directory being established. The Directory is a new government that was put in place from 1795 to 1799. It's basically an oligarchy, a legislative oligarchy, if that makes sense, in which you have 5 directors on the Directory who are basically the heads of the Directory. And then you're going to have a 750-seat legislature split up into 2 houses. The Council of 500 is one house, and that's like the lower house. And then the Council of the Ancients is kind of the more powerful house, the more prestigious house. So this is a time during the French Revolution that, it's kind of a cooling down period that we get. Now, towards the end of the 1790s, we got another guy come to power, and that's Napoleon. Now, Napoleon was a Corsican by birth. Nobody really important. He's not really necessarily from any important nobility. As at the age of 10, he goes to France to go into a military academy, and he spends his time there. And he rises as high as he can in the ranks. He's an artillery officer, and a pretty skilled one. So he rises up to the ranks, and in the 1780s, Napoleon hits a ceiling. He can't rise any higher. Reason being is because he's not a member of the nobility. He can't go any farther. So even though he's very skilled and ambitious, he's stuck. Then the French Revolution happens, and you're going to have Napoleon taking full advantage of it. Napoleon was very good at being kind of this political chameleon, kind of doing things that were going to win him favor with whoever was in charge at the time. So he's not necessarily, he's more politically ambitious for himself than for any kind of idea. So all through the 1790s, Napoleon's going to be this very successful military commander, fighting a lot of battles against France's enemies, enemies of the Republic. So he uses this military success to really rise through not only the ranks of the military, but also get into politics, French politics. So Napoleon is going to be so popular by the time you get to the late 1790s that the Directory is going to think that they should bring him on as a member of that five, the top five execs. So the reason being is because the Directory was kind of slow in changing anything or doing anything in general. So in order to make their government popular, they asked Napoleon to join. So Napoleon joins the Directory. A couple years later, he rewrites the Constitution, and he declares himself consul for life of this new government that he's put in place. So he stages a coup d'état in 1799 against the Directory. That's the kind of the final death nail for the Directory. In 1802, Napoleon's going to declare himself consul for life. So that's kind of like what Caesar had kind of done. And then in 1804, he declares himself Emperor Napoleon I. So now we have an emperor running France as opposed to a king. Now, it's kind of interesting when you look at it in this perspective that the French Revolution starts in 1789. They kill their king in 1793, and by 1804 we now have one guy in charge again who's called emperor. But the word emperor was not necessarily a dirty word like king was. All right, emperor is very Roman, right? They could hail back to the glory of the Roman Empire, and Napoleon knew that, so he takes the title emperor. But it's basically a king on the throne again. So Napoleon has this very successful rise and comes to dominate after 1804. Now, after 1804, Napoleon's going to have a number of successful battles and campaigns against the enemies of the French. He invades the Holy Roman Empire in 1806 and finally disbands that after hundreds of years. Austria, northern Italy, invasion into Spain, and so Holland, the Netherlands, I'm sorry. And so he creates this large continental empire. So basically by the time you get to 1810, France dominates the continent of Europe. All right. Now, the British dominate the ocean. The British had won the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, and they maintained their dominance of the oceans. So Napoleon's never able to basically invade the United Kingdom or control the seas, but he feels he controls Europe. He's master of Europe. And so what he puts into place is what's known as the continental system. So Napoleon uses this continental system to make all the countries that he's taken over. He pretty much says to them, all right, you're now part of this French empire, or you're now a French satellite. You cannot trade with Great Britain. So he puts these trade restrictions on his satellites. And the goal of it was to kind of economically cripple the British. And it works to a degree. The British weren't very happy with it. Now, one of his allies by 1810 was Russia. Russia and France had an agreement to follow up with this continental system. So the Russians, however, end up breaking this agreement and trade with Great Britain. So Napoleon's going to see this as a total insult to the agreement that he had with Tsar Alexander I, and he decides to invade Russia. Napoleon raises the Grande Armée, seen here in the left and the right. The Grande Armée was about 600,000 men. All right, so it was the largest military force that Europe had ever seen up to that point. So he takes his Grande Armée into Russia, and as you guys all know, Russia's very vast, very large, and it's cold. So by the time Napoleon finally gets to Moscow, he fights a major battle called the Battle of Borodino, right outside of Moscow, and it's pretty much a draw as to who won. The Russians retreated, and the French army kept moving on. So they captured Moscow after the Battle of Borodino, but when Napoleon got there, it was totally deserted. And what the Russians had started to do is they started to burn the city as they retreated. So the Russians were burning Moscow and all the surrounding countryside around Moscow with the hope that this would starve the French out. Because an army on the move with that kind of a supply line that's stretched needs to find food around them, needs to take it from villagers, needs to take it from farms and what have you. So the Russians were trying to starve the French out, and it worked because the French are going to be forced to retreat. Napoleon left way ahead of his army to put down political unrest in Paris. So a couple weeks after that, the Grande Armée officially decides to abandon Moscow, and the entire army retreats back to Europe. It's on the way back that a lot of them succumb to cold, starvation, attacks from Cossacks that would do hit-and-run attacks on the army. There's accounts of soldiers taking their horses and slitting a little bit into their throats to collect their blood. Not so much that it would kill the horse, but they would collect the blood, and then they'd take the blood and put it into boiling water, and then they'd coagulate into these blood balls that they would then, live off of. So the whole army just completely falls apart. The first, safe city that they get to is Vilnius in modern-day Lithuania. Now, Vilnius, by the time they get there, the army was starving, and so a lot of them break into houses and take food. And when you're starving for that long, you'll go into cardiac arrest if you haven't eaten too much, and then you all of a sudden gorge yourself on food. So a lot of them die of cardiac arrest. There's accounts of soldiers breaking into university hospitals and stuff, and stealing the formaldehyde-soaked animals and organs and eating them out of the jars. So it was a pretty horrible scene. But by the time it's all said and done, thousands and thousands of French are dead. Now Napoleon loses another major battle, the Battle of the Nations in 1813. This is kind of the beginning of the end for Napoleon. You're going to have Napoleon then retreat back to Paris and basically be surrounded by all the nations of Europe, all the major powers. The British, the Prussians, the Russians, the Austrians have all kind of banded together to try to get rid of this great usurper, Napoleon. So you have what's called the Treaty of Fontainebleau, in which Napoleon is forced to abdicate, step down, and they have him go live on this island called Elba, right off the coast of Italy. It's a pretty nice place. It's nice weather, palm trees, sandy beaches. They let Napoleon be in charge of the home guard on the island. And he's leading what would seem to be a pretty quiet life on this island. But a guy that completely ran a large French empire, and you're now asking him to live on this island and, be in charge of basket weaving and stuff like that. Obviously, he got a little, restless. So Napoleon decides to get on a boat, leave the island, and head back to France. So he takes a boat to France. He gets off on the shore, and he encounters guards, soldiers on the beach. The soldiers raise their guns up, pointed at Napoleon. Napoleon takes off his cloak again, shows them who he is, and basically says, "You're not going to shoot your emperor, are you?" And then the guards put their guns down, and they end up following him. And Napoleon moves on to Paris. Now, through the journey to Paris, he gains a large following, soldiers and whatever he sees on the way. Before he even gets to Paris, the king, Louis XVIII, who had been put on the throne, flees the city and runs, and basically leaves Paris open for Napoleon. Napoleon takes charge again in early 1815. This is what's known as the 100 Days. 100 days in which Napoleon is back in charge. Now, the rest of the countries in Europe are kind of angry of this, that Napoleon's now back in charge. They have to do something again. So the British and the Prussians muster an army, all right, to meet Napoleon's army. And this is at Waterloo in modern-day Belgium. The two sides meet, and it's an all-day struggle, pretty bloody. But when it's all said and done, Napoleon is defeated once more. And this is his final defeat. Napoleon is then forced to go live on the island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic. St. Helena is, completely one of the most desolate, isolated places on Earth. So they originally had him on Elba, which was pretty close to Europe. Now they put him on St. Helena, which is hundreds of miles from anything close. So Napoleon is forced into exile to St. Helena, and he dies there by the 1820s. So that ends pretty much his kind of reign. Now, after Napoleon is defeated, you have what's called the Congress of Vienna meeting. They met from 1814 to 1815, and it's basically diplomats from different European countries met at this Congress, and the idea is what they have to do is, what are we going to do with Europe now? Napoleon's defeated, the French Revolution is over, what do we do? So it's basically they redraw the map of Europe. A lot of the conservatives at the Congress of Vienna were trying to basically turn the clock back to the way it was before this nasty French Revolution ruined everything. All right, so they wanted to turn the clock back to 1789, basically. And they did this by restoring the Bourbon kings to the throne of France. Louis XVIII here, the brother of Louis XVI, is put on the throne. So it kind of goes back to where they started. So the Congress of Vienna, though, was successful in basically achieving peace, relative peace in Europe for about 99 years. There were a few wars in between there, but not a major continental European struggle. So the Congress of Vienna is kind of hailed as a diplomatic success in a lot of ways. It managed to maintain this peace. It managed to maintain the balance of power in Europe. And that's what European politics are always about, maintaining this power balance. You can't let one country be too powerful than the other. Now, to think about the French Revolution and where it took us, all right, think of it as this cyclical movement that it started at one point in 1789. It goes to the National Assembly with the Third Estate, then the National Convention, then the Robespierre and the radical phase and the Jacobins, and then the Thermidorian reaction, then the Directory, and then Napoleon, and then the Bourbon Restoration. All right, so it goes in one big circle, basically. And there's going to be, two more major French revolutions after this. So it continues to go in this cyclical kind of movement until you get to the 1870s, 1871. So even though the revolution's kind of over and they went back to where they started, the influence that the French Revolution has or had on the French people does not go away. It's just that France is going to struggle with what it wants to be. Does it want to be a republic, or do we want a Napoleon on the throne? Because there's going to be another Napoleon in the 1860s. So it's just, they're really struggling with what they want, what kind of identity they want. So it's kind of interesting, but it's very much a major impact on European and world affairs for sure.